Hi, welcome to Evolution and the Human Mind. This is the first time I've actually uh, spoken in front of a camera without a live audience involved, so it's a steep learning curve for me. Well, I'll do my best. Um, if I seem to be a bit unsure of myself, then that's because I'm sitting here looking at a picture of myself, and the picture I'm looking at is about half a second behind what I'm saying, so it's a bit off-putting. But never mind, we'll get through it one way or the other. Before I start, I guess I better introduce myself. My name is Yehoshua. I use the surname Indagator on with organisations and websites that insist that I have two names. In fact, I only have one name, and the word indagator is Latin for investigator. And the reason I gave myself that name is because I love finding the why of things, and not just the how, but the why. So I'm not just interested in how things work. I want to know why they work. And this course is a consequence of that tendency that I have to examine the whys of things. You may have already checked out my website at academia.edu, but I'll just recap some of the things on there about me. I've had a very varied career. I've been an Air Force officer. I've been a Franciscan monk, a friar. I've been a family man. I've been and for the last over 40 years, I've been involved in the counselling, psychotherapy, business, social work / psychotherapy. So I'm by qualification, I'm a social worker, and by training, I'm what they call a Gestalt therapist and a group psychotherapist. And before I retired a few years ago, my occupation was as a group psychotherapy trainer. So I trained people who wanted to learn how to do psychotherapy. And my overriding talent, I guess, is the ability to see the big picture. And that's what this course is about. This course is about looking at the big picture, what we are and how we got here. And not only that, why did we get here and why are we? That as well. Yeah. So I'm so in this course, we'll be looking at the latest knowledge from a lot of disciplines, and we're going to pull them all together into one course and make it a one consistent story from beginning to end. And it's like unraveling a tangled ball of string and then wrapping it up in a nice, neat way again. And I'm not in the process of trying to train you to be or teach you to be a true believer. The purpose of this course is to raise questions. In other words, to encourage you to ask questions that you hadn't asked yourself before, and maybe to look at things from a different perspective than you have up till now. And I'll get more into the whys and wherefores of that in a minute. The reason why I'm doing this course is because I'm 79 and a half years old at the time of recording, and I'm aware that I'm not going to live forever. Opportunities for doing my former occupation are very slim, matter of fact, almost zero. That's mainly because of ageism. They don't like us wrinkled people sitting around making the place look untidy. They much rather have nice and shiny new people, young people. My goal is to pass on what I've the knowledge I have gained through training, education, and experience over the past, well, over the whole of my life, really. But in relation to the subject of psychology over the last 40 years. And I've experienced a lot of people in that time. I've, in terms of them coming and bearing their souls to me. And I've worked with a lot of groups so that I've got a pretty good handle on how groups work and what it's all about. And now we're going to look at what the whys of it all. Why do things work that way? And I hope by the end of the course, I will have answered that question. It is a long course. It's a 4-term course, but a very interesting one. I ran it last year, and the 2 people who were in it, mind you, I started out with 8, but only 2 managed to last the course because it is a very demanding course in terms of challenging the preconceptions that we all have, we all bring along, that were given to us by our ancestors and by our parents, and that we pick up along the way. And particularly if we reach maturity around about the 1970s and 80s, then we're going to have some ideas in our head that are a long way from reality as far as how the human mind works. And I'll tell you later why that is so. Right, so that's me. That's who I am, or what I am. Now, like I said, the real reason, the reason I want to do this course is to pass the information on that I've got inside my head to somebody else before the undertaker comes and asks me to go and visit him in his shop. And I would feel a lot better on that last day of my life, knowing that I had made an attempt to pass on what I know. And that's why I'm sitting here. And I hope you find the whole journey enjoyable. I did, and the guys last year did, because they signed up for another course this year. So they hadn't had enough last year, so they want some more. Today is in the form of an introduction, where we're introducing the course and what you'll be covering in the four terms of the course. And I might just expand a little bit on some of the issues, or some of the items, but we won't go too deeply into things today. It's just a general introduction to what you signed up for, and the journey that you'll be embarking on. And hopefully I'll be able to get these videos out to you every week. That's my well, not my goal. It's what I plan to do. It's my plan, not a goal. It's not a pipe dream. It's what I'm actually making sure happens. But however, being of a certain age, sometimes health issues get in the way and make it a little bit difficult. If that happens, then I'll send you a message to let you know what's going on. All right, so we're about to embark on term 1. If you see me looking up, that's because I'm talking into a laptop, and above the laptop is my desktop, and all my notes are on my desktop, so I have to look up to see my notes. I don't have many notes. I don't like talking off notes. For me, it's a bit too stilted. I like to challenge myself with the idea of speaking naturally and spontaneously, hoping that the non-conscious part of my brain will release the information as and when I need it. Sometimes it doesn't, but there you go. As you know, as we get older, we have some memory problems, and retrieving stuff gets a little harder. Not impossible, absolutely not impossible, just a little harder. All right. So first up is term 1, and in term 1 we're going to be looking at evolution, genes, and the brain. So we're looking at that in a sort of a revision. If you've done these things before, then it'll be a revision. If you haven't done them before, it will be an introduction. It's not a highly technical course, not a highly technical coverage. It's the basics that you know to be able to move on to the rest of the course. So you need to know something about evolution. you need to know something about genetic inheritance, and you need to know something about how the brain works. And that's basically what we'll be doing in this term. We're having the introduction now. That's the first week. The next one will be a brief history of the philosophy of mind. Now, the reason I introduced that is because we need to know where we came from in order to understand why we think the way we do now. I mean, when I say we, I'm talking about the people who have not learned what I'm about to teach you. The people who are still using the learning theory method of psychology, which does not allow for biology. It keeps biology completely out of the picture. It doesn't want to know about biology, which is quite, as far as I'm concerned, crazy because our body and brain are very intimately intertwined, and they both influence each other. And to say that our behaviour has nothing to do with our biology is crazy. Yeah. Anyhow, of course, the reason for that is that after in the second half of the 20th century, people had enough of people in the first half of the 20th century talking about eugenics and cleaning up the gene pool and saying our behaviour is instinctual and we have no choice in what we do, and therefore we can't change anything. So there was a big reaction to that in the second half of the 20th century, and the pendulum swung completely in the opposite direction and went to believing that everything is learned, everything we know is learned from the time we're born. Or maybe they might have even extended that to the womb. At least from the time we're born, everything that we are and everything we do and everything we know is learned after that, or during and after that. However, recent research in the different scientific fields have shown us that no, that's not the case. Yes, the environment does have an influence on us. It has quite a strong influence on us. However, so does our genetic inheritance, the information or the instructions that we received for creating our brain. And as you'll see later, it's how your brain is constructed, and it's different for everybody. Slightly different, but not greatly different. It's slightly different for everybody. So no two people can learn the same thing in the same way from the same environmental influence, because of the way their brains are constructed slightly differently. We'll get more into why that happens. Okay, so that brief history of the philosophy of mind will be about the last maybe 2,000-3,000 years, and how we went from one way of looking at things through various other stages until we reach where we are now. Then we'll be looking at evolution by natural selection, which is what Charles Darwin did. And basically what that means is, as far as our DNA is concerned, the most important thing, mind you, Charles Darwin didn't know about DNA, but we do now. As far as our DNA is concerned, the most important thing is passing itself on to the next generation. That's all it wants to do. And by natural selection, people who have behavioural traits or physical abilities that enable them to survive better in the current environmental situation. Now we're talking about ice ages, and we're talking about meteor collisions, and we're talking about all sorts of natural events that made life difficult, droughts, famines. Later on we had there were pestilence, of course we always had pestilence, and later on we had very, very well developed warfare as well to make life difficult. So people who had the behavioural and physical traits that made survival more likely pass on their genes to the next generation, and those that didn't pass their genes on, they didn't survive long enough to pass them on. And that's how natural selection occurs. And then we're going to look at how evolution and the genes fit together. But we will be looking at how the genes work and what they are, how they're constructed, how we get them, and what the job is that they do. But not in a like highly technical way, just in the minimum amount of knowledge you need in order to understand what we're talking about. And we'll also be talking about the role of genetic mutations in natural selection, which is very highly important. Genetic mutations are going on all the time. They're going on us in our own. As we get older, we have continual genetic mutations. That's what the aging process is. I'm not going to blow my nose now. So the aging process is our genes aren't replicating as well as they used to. So little bits of us, little by little, start misbehaving in our body and in our brain. But there's no avoiding that. That's the way things are. Then we'll be looking at how evolution shaped the human brain, and how the brain sort of came about. And I'll give you a bit of a what they call it, a spoiler here, a spoiler alert. No one really knows what caused us to develop a highly intelligent brain compared to, or seemingly compared to other species. And just a little sidetrack there. The only way we can measure or compare ourselves to other species and our level of intelligence compared to them is by the fact that we are able to conduct language with symbols. In other words, we can create written words, we can create spoken vowels and symbols that we are able to pass on to other generations. And with other species, you don't see them sitting down and passing on the knowledge that they had in one generation to the next. The only thing that gets passed on is what is in their genes. However, we have the ability to pass on non-genetic information from generation to generation. So that distinguishes us from the other species. And that's the only thing, by the way, that distinguishes from the other species. And then the last, finally, in the term one, we'll be looking at the neurobiology of behaviour. In other words, how the brain influences what we do, what we think, what we feel, and what we do, and what are the processes in the brain that do that. Okay, so that's term one. Now we'll move on to term two. Just quickly go through that one because we'll have a better introduction at the beginning of term two. But basically, that one is about neurobiology, behaviour, and evolutionary psychology. So it's about the brain and behaviour, and an introduction to the field of evolutionary psychology, which is a branch of psychology, a very recent branch, has only been in existence since the 1980s. It's a branch of psychology that looks at human behaviour as a result of evolution rather than purely as a result of learning. And I do have to put in a bit of a proviso here that it's not an either-or situation. It's not genes or environment. It's both. The environment works on the genes, and the genes respond to the environment. So it's not an either-or situation. It's 50-50. And just as getting ahead of ourselves here, our genes, we have a certain number of genes, all sorts of genes for all sorts of purposes. Now, certain genes don't get turned on unless the environmental conditions are there to turn them on. And it's like a woman's natural ability to be a mother. In other words, her mothering abilities. She doesn't learn those. I mean, you don't go to school and learn how to be a mother. Your mother doesn't teach you how to be a mother. You might observe your mother being a mother, but that might not be a good model. I don't know. Some are, some aren't. However, how to be a mother is already in your brain. It's a circuit or a network in your brain. However, for that to be switched on, you have to have a small baby in your arms, a very small baby, one with a little head, sort of more biggish head, biggish eyes, big eyes compared to the size of the face, and a smallish sort of face. And it's those triggers, those environmental triggers, that trigger the network in your brain to start operating. Now, if the environment doesn't do the triggering, the networks in the brain don't fire and don't work. So it's not just not genes alone; it's the environment and the genes. All right. So we'll be looking at, as I said, we're going to be looking at term 2. We're going to be looking at neurobiology of behaviour, and we're going to start looking at evolutionary psychology. Okay, then we'll move to term 3. And in term 3, we're calling that one evolutionary psychology 1. So that's like an introduction to evolutionary psychology. I'm going to be talking about all sorts of interesting things. Well, I think they're interesting. We're going to talk about the conceptual history. In other words, what are the concepts involved in that discipline? We'll be talking about it's called investigating the unmentionable, which means we're going to be talking about things that you're not supposed to talk about in polite society, which is religion, sex, and what's the other thing? Politics. Religion, sex, and politics. You're not supposed to talk about those in polite society. But in this course, yes, we will be talking about. In terms of natural, like evolutionary adaptation, how they adapt, how they came about through adaptation. Okay, so we're going to talk about evolved psychological mechanisms, how we got those, how long they take to form. In other words, for any given situation, we already have an evolved for most situations, we already have an evolved psychological mechanism in our brain that gets switched on by the environment. But the proviso there is that if we know we have this mechanism and if we know it's being activated, we can actually stop it if we know it. If you don't know it, you can't stop it. But if you do know you've got it, you do know it's been activated, then you can do something about it consciously. Yeah, but more of that later. We'll be looking at the thing called the blank slate, which was the theory that came after the Second World War about saying that no, biology is not involved in human personality or human behaviour. It's all learning, and that theory has well and truly been challenged at the present. Then we're looking at evolutionary and evolutionary psychology around food, clothing, shelter, and health. And we'll be looking at the development of a thing called reciprocal altruism, which is where people who aren't related to each other get a kick out of helping each other. But the kick is usually a reciprocal one. So in other words, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that, however, has a very profound effect on developing ethics and morals. And we don't actually need religions for ethics and morals. We can get ethics and morals from this thing called reciprocal altruism, which should develop quite early in our species. But then we'll be talking about gender and sex differences in a biological sort of way. We'll be talking about the sex lives of vertebrates. In other words, monogamy, polygamy, well, that's about it. All sorts of other subheadings, and how they would have evolved, and what is probably what we have in our brain, and why there is a difference between the way males approach, or the male sex drive is different from the female sex drive. It's not better, not worse. It's just different. And it's different for a purpose. It has a good reason for being different, as far as evolution is concerned. We'll be looking at the evolution of human sexuality, how that came about. We'll be looking at attraction, courtship, and mating. We'll be looking at love, attachment, and child rearing. And we'll be looking at parents, offspring, and families. So you can see we're covering a lot of stuff there. But the second half of term 3 will be devoted a lot to male-female relationships, or mating behaviour, to use the technical term, mating behaviour. Yeah. But it's like I said, it's done in a non-technical sort of way, in a way that's easy to follow and understand. Okay. I mean, you may not agree with it, but you can at least follow it. Now, In term 4, that'll be the second half, or evolutionary psychology 2. And here we'll be looking more at the warfare and political side of things. And we're looking at dominance and territoriality in the human species and primates. We're looking at politics, how that came about and what drives it. We're looking at adaptive conflict. In other words, sometimes a conflict, but in the evolutionary terms, it wasn't like we have now. It was a smaller affair. Conflict can be adaptive. It can actually drive evolution rather than impede it. We'll be looking at religion, and especially religion as a social glue holding people together. We'll be looking at religion and war, which is a co-evolutionary arms race, how the two went arm in arm, hand in hand. We'll be looking at adaptive pathologies, which means a lot of the things that we call craziness now, in fact, in evolutionary times, were adaptive. They help people survive. But now in the world that we've created, this civilization we have, modern day civilization, these things don't apply anymore. So they're maladaptive now. They were adaptive once, but they're maladaptive now. And then we were looking at the question of culpability. Can a person who's been charged with a crime get off the charge simply by saying, my brain made me do it? It's all down to my genes. I had no hand in it. And the short answer is no, they can't. Can't do that. Because evolution, I mean, environment does come into the picture. It's not just the brain. So they have to, the environment includes their own decisions, their own actions, and their lack of a willingness to change what their brain is making them do, which they're actually capable of doing. We are capable of doing it. It's not a given thing that we will automatically do what our brain tells us to do. Okay, and then we'll be looking at evolutionary aesthetics, that sort of art stuff. And finally, we're going to be looking at mindfulness and evolutionary psychology. And because mindfulness comes from Buddhist philosophy, and mindfulness, from my way of thinking of it, is really mindlessness, really. It's you can't switch off your mind. There's no way you can switch it off. There's no off switch for it. It runs 24/7, 365. And what we can do, though, is learn to sit back and observe ourselves from a distance rather than being totally bound up in it and dragged along as if we have no control. So the purpose of mindfulness, as practiced in the Buddhist tradition, of course, there's secular mindfulness now. It's not just Buddhist. The purpose of it is to equip people with make people better able to get control of these evolved psychological mechanisms that are driving them almost like instincts. And so and by doing that, it just involves practicing. There's no graduation ceremony. You never get to the point where you get a certificate for mindfulness. It's constant practice. You got to practice, practice, practice. Some days you have good days, some days you have bad days, as far as practicing. But it's just a question of sitting there and paying attention to what's going on inside you, your thoughts and your feelings, and not only inside you, but outside you as well, in your environment, sounds, sights, smells. In other words, rather than getting involved in your brain or your mind, getting sucked up into there and living your whole life going around and around in the world of your thoughts and feelings, you step out and you start looking at the world from the outside. You start looking at the world from the outside of your mind, from the outside of your feelings, and just observe them as if you were an impartial, unbiased observer. And like I said, that is I won't say it's not the, but it's a very powerful way of combating our evolved psychological mechanisms that are not adaptive in the world that we have created. And that's probably behind the course that I'm doing. Sort of the major part of it is that the way we evolved in forests, in small groups, no more than a couple of hundred people, and living in a very active lifestyle, very active lifestyle, always on the move. So there's no sitting down watching television or reading newspapers. They was always on the move, always doing something. And then they had what do you call it? The run of the whole country. In other words, there were no fences. There was no private property inside their own territory. It was all commonly owned. It sounds a bit like socialism, but 20th century socialism hasn't worked. So it's an abysmal failure. But more about that later. Yeah, just a little aside there. One of the guys who first introduced the idea of evolution into behaviour back in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, a guy named Wilson, was at a conference or a panel or something, or a meeting, where they were talking about socialism, and asked him what he thought about socialism. And he thought, socialism, a very good idea, he said, but the wrong species. In other words, the human species, and you'll find out more about this later, but the human species is not wired for equality, unfortunately. We may love to have equality. We would dearly love to have equality. We dearly love social justice and fairness. But unfortunately, our brains are not wired that way. That doesn't mean it's right not to, it doesn't mean it's right to be against social justice. It just means that in evolutionary times, the people who what do you call it, who survived the best were the ones who were able to defeat other people and grab more of the resources than other people. And it's a frightening thing when we think that we are the descendants of the people who won all the wars and who stole all the resources. What does that say about us? Maybe that's why it's so hard to what do you call it, implement things like socialism, social justice, equal rights. It's very hard to do because we are the descendants of the people who knocked all the other people on the head and took over the evolutionary process, as far as passing down their genes is concerned. Okay, well, that's the whole sordid story. I hope I haven't put you off. And like I said, I enjoy the teaching process. Well, actually, it's not a teaching process; it's more like a conversation. I like talking to people about the things that I've learned and the things I think that are important. But everyone is different. No two people are identical. Even identical twins aren't completely identical. But if you're not an identical twin, then you've got no chance of being the same as anyone else. And the reason for that is we all have different mutations in our genes. Mutations are happening all the time. And our parents had mutations in theirs, and they passed on mutations to us. And their mutations were different from the people down the road and across the street. So we've all got little funnies in our heads and in our bodies. And so what suits one person, or what works for one person, probably or may not, or could not, or shall not work for someone else. So my hope is that this works for you. If it doesn't, that's all right. You've learned something different from what you've been told so far, and you can take it into account and slot it away somewhere. Just a word of warning: if you're ever listening to a guru of some sort, or a teacher, or it might be about dieting or whatever it might be, if they use the word "the" a lot instead of "a," in other words, this is the method, the answer, the cure, there's the cure for everything, then run as fast as you can, because they don't have access to science. They're not fully scientific, because science tells us there is no "the," there's only "a." There is an answer that may work for some people. There is a cure that might work for some people. there is a method of or lifestyle that might work for some people, but there's no such thing as the diet, the cure, the answer. Yeah. And on that confusing note, I'll say farewell, and hopefully you'll want to hear the next one, which will be. I will send an email to you before the next one, just to sort of get your brain working. And you have to remember that my idea of the brain is that 90% of it is working very hard, but we don't know what's going on in there. We have no access to what it's doing. And it only pushes into our consciousness little bits, tiny bits of what it's doing. I mean, the usual number is 10%. And so it's doing a hell of a lot in there, working away merrily and madly. It's the most powerful data processing system in the universe that we know of. And don't believe the artificial intelligence people. They're not even close. They have computers that can accomplish certain tasks faster than humans. But as far as a overall data processing system, the human brain is the most efficient. And have you ever thought of how come we can operate so effectively when we don't have a data storage facility? In other words, we don't have hard drives that we have to put in our pockets or drag around behind us in a trolley. We don't have to stay attached by a wire to a big building with all our memories stored in it, which is what happens with Google and places like they have to rent huge facilities all around every country around the world, huge facilities to put all their equipment to store all the data that they want to process. Now, the human brain may not be able to have instant access to all that data, might even know all that data. However, when it comes to processing that and getting the memories of our lives out into our consciousness, that can't be done any quicker by a machine than it's done by the human brain. Anyhow, I'm trying to think of some pithy thing to end on, but I can't say. So farewell for now, and I'll be seeing you later. Bye bye.